Bible, it's back. Alright, so today I'm reacting to a video. The evidence for Jesus is worse than you think, by Holy Kool-Aid. Which I guess they want to say that you're drinking the Holy Kool-Aid, but they are drinking the Holy Kool-Aid. And there's one host, but there's a whole team. Okay, hey, there's 20 or 30 people contributing to these videos. So, we're talking about big time pro. I'd like to say commie, but I don't know if they're communists. They are left wing. I've seen them kind of do some stuff that way. And I saw one video which wasn't so bad. It was on their side, but it wasn't so bad. But this video particularly, right? This is like a big, fest. Okay, it's just poo-poo what you're gonna do, okay? So, anyhow, their first contention is something interesting because I've not really been a big fan of this particular piece of evidence, but it's been used in a lot of weird ways, and apparently, they go through and they debunk it, and I'm fine with that, okay? What it is they said there was a fragment from Mark's Gospel. They had claimed about 10 years ago that it was from the first century and it was a scrap of the Gospel that they used to make paper mache pharaoh mask. Okay, so that it really doesn't seem like, it's such a great piece of evidence to me, but anyhow, they had claimed this some time ago, and then they said, oh, and it doesn't have the long ending of Mark. Well, what we've found since is they gave us another papyrus in its stead that was not from the pharaoh mask. And they said that was the same thing. And it was from the 2nd or 3rd century instead of the 1st century. And it's 3 verses. Of course, it doesn't have the ending of Mark. Okay, so I understand. If you got a good point, you got a good point. So thumbs up on that one. And then it starts getting a little freaky from there. They start going over the historicity of this and that, and they don't go as far as the existence of Jesus, and they're patting themselves on the back, like, "Oh no, we do believe. We all us atheists believe that Jesus existed." Well, you got a lot of these big public debates that, you got a whole movement called the Jesus mythicist movement, okay? You've been promoting this, all right? If you want to speak for atheists, okay, you atheists have been promoting this for the last 10, 15 years now and trying to claim that Jesus never existed, which is on the same level of factuality as the flat earth conspiracy, okay? And it just is. You don't really know history if you think Jesus didn't exist. In fact, you're going to write out a date, and that date is going to approximate when Jesus was born. Now, we feel like it was off by 4 years, but that was the whole point, okay? So, this is one of the most acknowledged recorded facts in human history was the existence of Christ. Well, anyhow, so they pat themselves on the back. Oh yeah, we do believe existed. But actually, no, you as a movement have been promoting, you've had big public debates with Bart Ehrman that Jesus does not exist, and you had Richard Carrier come out with stuff like that. This other guy, I forgot his name, but apparently he did get a doctorate, somewhere. And, you just kind of threw out this whole conspiracy. Why? Because everything in the quote-unquote new atheist movement is propaganda, and it is pushing a faith. Now, one of the things they went over, and they took a speech from Gary Habermas, and Gary Habermas didn't actually say anything wrong. They just decided to twist it anyway. And that is that he said that the same methods used to determine the existence of George Washington are the same methods used to determine the existence of Christ. But they were like, well, okay, so he's not saying that, but, let's look at the difference of evidence. So they go through the evidence. And what they do, and this is the biggest problem of this whole system of thought, they criticize anything religious, specifically hyper criticize anything Christian. Okay? They have an extreme bias and to goofy proportions. And then they do not criticize anything that they assert. So they said, well, George Washington's got all this evidence. Okay. They said, they have his grave. We could have put another body there. They have people that talk to him. Well, could have been an impersonator. Well, they have his bed. And by the way, I visited the bed. Okay. It's a nice bed, but, it is pretty short. And so, you got this tall guy with a short bed. Was it really his bed? Mm-hmm. Or is that just, did I just go to, I think it was in Virginia, and, you go up this plantation and all that kind of stuff. Oh, here's the trees that they planted. Could it be that, like, maybe that was just a house that they claimed was it? I mean, we've got Disneyland, okay? We've got a lot of fake things out there. You got Rocky. Maybe he existed because he's got a statue, okay? In fact, they're tearing down George Washington statues, all the BLM and all them, yay, communism, and. So they're destroying history left and right anyhow, and that's what they did, okay? That's going to happen. There are going to be, if you have somebody who led a massive movement, there are going to be enemies who then want to destroy the evidence that they existed. Muslims do this all the time, okay? Muslims, communists, the whole nine yards. I saw a church being destroyed over in China, okay? So if you have these people come through, then you're going to expect that there's going to be damage, and obviously there's going to be more damage in terms of Jesus 2,000 years ago than Washington. But if you want to examine these things critically, okay, then they were like, oh, well, he's got paintings. Well, Jesus got paintings. Well, he's got a bust. Okay, well, Jesus has the Shroud of Turin, and they came out with this. They were like, well, we proved it wrong. We carbon dated it. Okay. It's internationally known. Okay. It's peer reviewed that the carbon dating method that they used to give that short date, that medieval origin of the Shroud of Turin, was out of fabric that had these nuns fixing the shroud. So they had their cotton there, intermingled, and they decided to cut out that piece. Okay? That was their big evidence. Let me see here, sorry. So basically, I think it was Ray Rogers. Was it Roy Ray? I mean, I think of the cowboy, but there's the scientist who worked on that project with the shroud in 2005 or 6. He did get that all taken care of. He took another sample and he found that there were fibers of cotton that were interweaving by these nuns, and then he tested them and found that it was a spurious date. That everybody knew that, but apparently, holykoolaid, we don't have to know the new facts. Yeah. Not to mention all the other evidence for the Shroud of Turin. From the fact that even the weaving itself was by Jewish women in the first century, pollen, you know, um, the fact that, like, this was not paint because it didn't seep through, it didn't leak through. It was kind of like a mist of film that you couldn't even see until the 20th century. Okay, you couldn't see the exposure of the shroud until then. So we do have an image of Jesus, and most of the pictures of Jesus in iconography have a similar thing. They got that strong bridge of the nose and, all that kind of stuff going on. And they all go along with that theme. Now, usually in iconography, they have the nail in the palm, but here they have the nail in the wrist. Okay, which was something people discovered in archaeology to be accurate. But we've had possession of this shroud, okay, since 900 AD in France. Right. Um, we've got the Sudarium of Oviedo, which matches the shroud in 114 places. Okay, the Sudarium was the headcloth that you put over somebody who's been crucified so that women and children don't have to look at the face, the tongue drooping down past the neck, and all sorts of crazy stuff going on in mutilation. They wrap up the head. Okay. So the Bible talks about that. They had a face cloth and then they had the shroud. Well, guess what? We found the Sudarium and it matches in 114 different cuts and bruises to the headpiece. And then there is another piece that was painted called the Mandalion. And the Mandalion matches up with that, and so that's where we got the image of Jesus, and that's where we get the bust that we put on the coins starting around 600 AD. Okay, so we do have just as much certainty in many ways. Okay, obviously a lot of things are going to be missing. When we talk about the existence of Christ, and when we talk about the existence of Christ, I'm going to go through a couple of these things, but let me hit a couple things that I've got recorded, and I'll put it down for people. All right, if I can get that. Just a second here. There we go. Okay. So, now you have to understand that the Temple AD was destroyed in 72 AD. That's important because all the records in Jerusalem were destroyed. So we have to get our evidence somewhere else. Now, there is some evidence of a guy in the Gospels who knew Jesus well, and in these records, he knew him even better than what the Gospels say, but nothing that in this account really contradicts it. Now, in this book I've got right here, it's called Encyclopedia of Archaeology, the Great Archaeologist. We hear this guy, William Camden, okay? And let me give you a little brief synopsis here. It says he was an Oxford classic scholar, he was a genealogist, a numismatist, an etymologist, a topographer, a Jacobean political scientist, a school teacher. William Campbell was an example of the English Renaissance person, the first scholar to record the rich history of British antiquity. To publish it in English, he linked English antiquities and humanist scholars and their contemporary European counterparts. So, extremely high functioning scholar right here. It says effectively the founder of the antiquarian studies in England through his immensely influential book, Britannia. Okay, and so it says William Camden was able to bring exceptional wide range of skills to elucidate of the remote past of his country. Now, I've got some documents elsewhere where he goes over the history of Glastonbury, and he talks about Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph of Arimathea that was in the Gospels, apparently, he was a rich man, and he was a miner of tin. And in the southeast England, Somerset had a tin mine. Now, it's the only tin mine in that part of Europe, okay? In the Old Testament, they used to call it Tarshish, but the Greeks used to call it the Cassarides. And this was the British Isles and the coast of France and the northern tip of Spain. And so Tarshish was, all that. And, the only tin mine was out there. Well, the Jews would go to Tarshish for their tin when Solomon was making the temple. And I don't want to get way deep into the woods there, but essentially, um, you know, Joseph Arimathea made many trips out there. He was the guy who had the body of Jesus, and so theoretically, he probably owned the Shroud of Turin. Okay, and I believe that there's many myths about him throughout Europe, and they talk about him having the Holy Grail containing the blood of Christ. I believe that that was the copper cylinder that they used to keep the Holy Grail in. Sorry, not the Holy Grail. That is the copper cylinder they used to keep the Shroud of Turin in. Okay? Because the Shroud of Turin, what? It contained the blood of Jesus. So, and there is his DNA. All right. So, I mean, there's a lot going on here. But essentially, it also links up to the tomb. All right. The tomb of Jesus was called the Garden Tomb, or they called it Gordon's Tomb. They found it in the 1800s. The more popular Tomb of the Holy Sepulchre has no real evidence to it, and so I don't believe it. It's not the end of the world if that was it, but I don't think so. However, there's a couple other things matching with it. You have the Great Stone, okay? Um, the Great Stone that was rolled in front of the tomb and then got rolled away. Um, It was found in Mount Nebo, so they call it the Great Stone of Mount Nebo. It was guarded by Eastern Orthodox soldiers. And essentially, this thing, was well known as the door. And it fit with the Garden Tomb. Does not fit in the Holy Sepulchre. Because there's a groove that you roll the stone across. And this groove or this ditch, it fit, the stone was about 15 inches. This thing started out about 16 and then grew a little bit to 18 inches. So, the stone could fit there. It was big, though. It was about 9 feet tall, 3,000 or 4,000 pounds. Now, the Garden Tomb also inside you see a frame that's 5'8" for the body, but then they cut in where the feet are about 2 or 3 inches, and so that would say that's about 5'10" to 5'11" would be the size of the body that ended up there. And of course, Joseph Arimathea would have carved it out for himself, and him being a minor of 10, there's no problem that he carved it out. But Jesus would have been 5'10" or 5'11". The body that is portrayed in the Shroud of Turin, 5 foot 10 to 11 inches. Okay. And once you get some of this stuff together, we've got a guy who could have provided the shroud because the shroud was found in Liry, France. And Liry was about 10 miles away from the Seine River. And the Seine River would have been the river that Arimathea would have done his trade route on. Okay. So usually what they do is they go over to France. They don't feel like going across the ocean because of all the waves and everything. So they go to France and then they haul their stuff to a certain point and start up the Seine River. And then they can make it to the British Channel and then make it to England and everything like that. So basically now you have like that whole archaeological tale. And of course, Joseph Arimathea is a famous person, okay, because he was rich and famous. And you have these guys like Camden and stuff showing that this was a historical thing. There's a lot of fictional novels about it, okay, but that only points to maybe there's something true and historical behind the myth, and it's why it's so famous. So that's kind of where we get things there. But we have about 300 or 400 Bible prophecies about Christ. Now, why is this important? Because he asked a question. He said, Okay, so he exists, but why is he any important than any other cult leader? Well, you had 300 or 400 Bible prophecies about him. I picked up something just the other day. Okay, I was preaching through the book of Exodus, and Jesus is the Passover lamb. And so, of course, we talk about the door where you have the nails on the cross. Like Jesus said, I am the door. Okay. And then when they put the Passover, they put blood on one side of the door and on the other side of the door and then on the top of the door. Okay. Which would be the three big wounds that Jesus had on the cross. Okay. So it's pointing to that. Well, it turns out that they used hyssop, okay, these hyssop bush, to take the blood and paint it on and all that kind of stuff. Well, then when they feed Jesus, they take the hyssop and they feed him vinegar through the hyssop, okay, because it's very spongy. So, you have these little things like, oh, okay, well, he is being made. When they put him in the spear and they drain him of the blood and the water, okay, that's what you do when you prepare the sacrifice. You drain it of the blood and water, all right? So, all of a sudden, all these things come together, and that's pagan Romans not knowing what they're doing, matching up with the prescription for Jesus to be the Passover lamb. And I do believe that he was slain. Instead of Friday, I believe he was slain on Wednesday, which was the Passover. So that would have been the exact same time. All right. So then they talk about the Gospels, and the Gospels can't be reliable. They're 50 years later. Well, you're only saying 50 years later because you were wrong about it being 200 years later. I've got the quotes from early scholars that show that they were thinking it was the 2nd or 3rd century when the Gospels were written. They got debunked rather easily because we have these writings of ancient church fathers and bigwigs that were in the early church and people who knew the apostles. So we not only do we have the apostles, but we have people that knew the apostles, and they knew the authors of the gospel. And so it was written down by Eusebius. And not only do we have the historians of the church that kind of laid out those things, but we also have all these other writings, and in the sermons by the early church, we have many printed sermons, and we have enough quotations to actually make out the entire New Testament. Okay? We actually have every verse in the New Testament at some point is quoted in these sermons. So we have the whole Bible before that big 2nd or 3rd century. Not only that, but when it comes to preservation, the issue is not if you have the original documents, because everybody knows that the originals will eventually wear down and fade away. The issue is if you have preservation, and we do have very strict preservation, preserved copies. 99% of the text is in agreement in what we call the Byzantine manuscripts. And we have over 5,000, close to 6,000 manuscripts of the New Testament in Greek thousands of years ago. Okay. So all these things are done. We have an extremely super accurate system where the Jews would preserve the entire Old Testament by the consonants. Okay, so the consonant of every word, they have every single letter, every single consonant letter together, and they also have the vowels preserved with these dashes in the Masoretic text. And so we have like these things that are preserved, and we also have this other fact. Okay, we know that Paul got his stuff early on. We also know that Matthew was the first gospel written, but they like to lie about that. They claim some sort of gospel of evolution. Okay, so they made up this 40 or 50-year date because they were trying to get a late date. Okay, so that is begging the question. Okay, they were trying to get the late date. They tried to get the latest date, and they kept on being backed up. All right, so that's why they have the gospel dates there. That's not when they were written. That's just the latest writing they could get. And then they say that's the earliest we got. No, it's not the earliest you got. It's the latest that you got. So then, once you kind of like assume that, like, if somebody writes a historical detail that's pretty simple, okay, like the existence of such and such, well, now you just go with it, okay? So if they claimed to be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, then they're Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Luke, yes, he was a Gentile, and yes, he was not an original apostle. He might have counted as an apostle, okay, in another way, but because he's kind of secondhand. But here's the thing: Luke had interviewed people. And I know for a fact, if you just look at it textually, he got a lot of information from Mary. He got a lot of information from, and he could have borrowed from Mark, okay, but I don't think that Mark borrowed from Matthew. I don't know why Matthew would need Mark. It just makes absolutely no sense. Matthew was probably more literate than Mark was, okay, number one, because he was a tax collector. Number two, he was there, right? So why would he go to Mark for anything? If anything, then Mark was just borrowing from Matthew, and Luke was also borrowing from Matthew. That's what's going on there. But yeah, he had some other people. I think it was like the wife of Cusa. There's several stories where it kind of seems that that's what was going on there. But yeah, so Luke has got some people, but I mean, he's got Mary. Okay, he's interviewed some of these people, and so that all is extremely detailed, extremely accurate. Now we got 4 biographies, we got 2 genealogies. Okay, I mean, it's all kind of coming together. And so, why was the history of Jesus even a thing? Why did they ever question the history of Jesus? They didn't used to. Well, the reason is because once you start to see these things, even if you get rid of the miracles, you're really not getting rid of the resurrection. Number one. Why? Because every theory falls on its face and fails. Okay. Um, oh, he swooned and he just got out of there. Okay, well then why is it that he had guys go and get Lazarus and say, hey, you several guys move the 1,000-pound rock, but I'll go move a 4,000-pound rock after I'm beaten to death. Okay. No, they don't make any sense. Oh, well, you know what? The apostles paid off the guards. Well, if they paid off the guards, why couldn't they have paid off the judge before Jesus was crucified? Besides that, Judas ran off with the money anyway. Okay, so that don't make any sense either. Well, maybe the dogs got it because the dogs can chew through rock, and they really needed Jesus' little corpse. They had to chew through. They really did that, okay? But Super Jesus. I mean, it's almost as big a miracle. You got holes in his hands and holes in his feet. Okay, besides the fact that all his blood's been drained, he got packed with 70 pounds of material. He's not getting out that way. When they talked about Paul, okay, Paul was talking about the authority and revelation that he had received. But he wasn't talking about everything that he had wrote down or that everybody he had talked to. Okay. Because he had talked to the apostles for about 2 weeks. Number one. Number two, he was a persecutor of the church. And he had 500 people testify to him. And I believe that was while he was persecuting them. Okay. But he had 500 people testify that they had seen Jesus alive from the dead. And it's hard to kind of say, well, this is all, some sort of big illusion, because how do you have an empty tomb? Okay, and why would they mention the women seeing the empty tomb? Because that would have been embarrassment. Nobody back then would have believed the women. Okay, so the only reason they report it because they actually saw it. Okay, and they said, well, they've got the wrong tomb. Well, then how did they dress the body of Jesus? Right? If they didn't know where the tomb was, they couldn't have put the spices in them to begin with. So it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And you got other records too, and we could definitely take a lot of time going down that. But I guess I'll just make this one simple, and I'll put a link up for people to kind of look up what's really going on here. Catch you later.